disappearance of Reed Jeppson remains one of the most baffling and enduring mysteries in the annals of American missing persons cases. Reed was a bright and active 15-year-old boy from Salt Lake City, Utah, who vanished without a trace on October 12, 1964. He's been missing for 59, very nearly 60 years. He just went out to feed his dogs in the backyard and was simply never seen again, leaving his family and community shocked and confused. Despite extensive searches and investigation over the years, his case remains unsolved to this day. And I was going to say that no substantial leads have ever emerged here, but I don't think that would be true. There has been at least one pretty big lead here, but it just never led anywhere. But this lead makes so much sense that many people believe that maybe this is what happened to Reed, but how do you prove it when the person in question is dead? But let me tell you this entire case from the very beginning. This is Utah's oldest missing persons case and was reopened in 2010, and it's still being actively investigated to this very day. Reed Jeppson was born on the 28th of May 1949, which would make him 75 years old if he's still alive today. There's never been any evidence to suggest that he survived past 1964, but it's not worth discounting the possibility completely. He could still be out there somewhere, maybe. The Jeppsons were a big family. Reed was one of 12 children to Edward and Elizabeth Jeppson, although one daughter, Helen, sadly died at just 6 months old. But despite this tragedy, they were a big, happy family. Reed's oldest sister, Patricia, was 29 years old. She was married, had kids of her own, and the youngest was 7-year-old Keith, so Reed was pretty much smack bang in the middle. Edward was a doctor and he was able to provide his kids with a good life, despite there being so many of them. He built their home on the east side of Salt Lake City in Utah himself, with his own hands, at 1961 Browning Avenue. And they had this just absolutely massive garden, or backyard I should probably say, where the kids would just spend all of their free time. Reed loved to play football out there with his siblings, his neighbours, his friends, and he just generally loved football. This is American football, obviously. He was part of his school football team when he was a sophomore, and he'd actually just scored his first touchdown days before he went missing, so he was very much on a high at this point. Reed was a very popular teenager, both at school and outside of it. Like I said, he lived in Salt Lake City, but his family also had a ranch in Montana where they'd spend a lot of time in the summers as well. So Reed had a whole group of friends in both states. And he also had a lot of hobbies as well. He was an Eagle Scout, he wrestled, he had a paper round with his brother John that they woke up to do at 6 a.m. every single morning, and he loved dogs. He specifically loved training dogs to hunt birds. At the time of his disappearance, Reed had 2 dogs that he was entirely responsible for, and I kind of get the impression that this was very much a case of his parents being like, okay, fine, you can have some dogs, but they are on you, you have to look after them completely. And Reed took that responsibility on. He had 2 German short-haired pointers that he kept in kennels in their very large garden. And this was one adult dog and one puppy. And that's an important detail, so do remember that. So all in all, Reed didn't have a traumatic childhood. His siblings have never spoken about any big family issues. There was nothing really going on at home that might have made Reed want to run away. He was just a very happy teenager, as far as anyone was aware, at least. Seeing as the Jeppsons lived in Salt Lake City, you probably won't be surprised to learn that they were deeply Christian. They were part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were Mormons. And a lot of their family life revolved around the church, especially on Sundays. On Sunday, the 12th of October 1964, Reed wakes up and goes to a priesthood meeting with his brother John, as they did every week. And Reed and John were best friends. They shared a room, they were always together, they were brothers and besties. So they go to this meeting and then they come home for lunch. I was really confused in my research for this because in interviews, the siblings kept saying that they came home for dinner. And I was like, what time is this? What time did Reed go missing? But I think it's very similar to sort of the north-south lunch-dinner divide here in the UK. They kept referring to it as dinner, but this was lunchtime. At least what I would call lunchtime as a southerner. It was around midday. Anyway, they get home from this meeting and Suzanne, Reed's older sister, starts preparing lunch and she sees Reed get out a couple of cans of dog food and he says he's going to go down to the kennel in the garden and feed his dogs. And this was only about 200 yards away from the house, 180 metres. It was a big garden, but like in the grand scheme of things, he was only going to go down the garden and feed his dogs. Suzanne tells him not to take too long because obviously lunch is going to be ready soon, but he doesn't come back for it. Despite his sister's warning, it does seem like Reed might have decided to take the dogs on a very quick walk. A friend did later report seeing him with his dogs near the St Mary of Wasatch School, which was about a mile away from the Jeppson home. From my research, it does seem like investigators do believe that this sighting of him outside the school was legitimate, but a lot of sources also say the last sure sighting of him was his sister seeing him walk out with the dog food. So I'm not entirely sure, but I do think he did decide to go on this walk, or at least a friend saw him with his dogs near this school. Lunch came and went and Reed didn't return home, and then that afternoon they were all due to return back to church for Sunday school. And Reed was pretty dedicated to his church, to his religion. He wouldn't usually intentionally miss Sunday school, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then there was the 4 p.m. sacrament meeting, which he also didn't turn up for. John, Reed's brother and roommate, said that he went to bed that night expecting to wake up in the morning for their 6 a.m. paper route and see Reed in his bed as usual, but still he woke up the next morning and Reed wasn't there. He was never seen again. At the time of his disappearance, Reed was wearing a white cotton knit shirt, a reversible parka with one side black and one side blue, blue Levi's jeans and sneakers. Reed is a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes, and he had braces on his upper and lower teeth at the time of his disappearance. He was 5'6" and 140 to 150 pounds and 15 years old, so he probably had a lot more growing to do. That afternoon and evening, Reed's family called around all of his friends. They went out and searched for him, but eventually they turned to the police and after about 12 hours officially filed a missing persons report. Almost immediately, an intensive search for him began, with investigators focusing on the foothills on the east side of Salt Lake City, which is near the school and the Jeppson home. The family posted flyers all around the area and they joined in on all of the searches. Everyone did everything they could to try and find him. The captain of the youth bureau at the time, the bureau in charge of this search, was a Captain E.G. Seedorf, who asked hikers walking in the foothills in this area to look out for unusual mounds of earth and piles of stones, as well as to check around fallen trees, clumps of shrub growth and in crevices. He asked people basically to help them out with the search. He wanted people to look for areas in which Reed may have gone missing. It was written in the newspaper at the time that they wanted to see if he was trapped accidentally or hidden feloniously. I've tried to say that so many times, I can't. Circulars with a description and photo of Reed were also mailed to all police departments, even the smallest ones in Utah and in the surrounding states. Like, a lot of people were on the lookout for Reed, but there was never a single sign of him or the two dogs. And the two dogs have always been a very baffling point in this case because German short-haired pointers aren't exactly small dogs. I mean, they're not the biggest dog breed in the whole world, but they wouldn't exactly be able to run away or run around the area and not be spotted. I did a bit of research into this breed and according to the internet, they're gentle, loving, loyal, people-orientated dogs who are incredibly athletic. They can hold their own against wild animals and are often used for hunting. They're very protective. I've seen some people online saying there is no way that foul play or abduction could be involved in this case because Reed's dogs would have protected him. It would have been a lot more difficult to abduct and dispose of a teenager and two dogs as well than just a teenager. But the dogs have never been found. There's never been any sign of them, just as there's never been any sign of Reed. I mean, it definitely would have been harder to abduct Reed with two dogs, but I don't think it would have been impossible. I also did see in one source that apparently one of the dogs, presumably the older one, had recently gone missing for 2 weeks and had made his own way back home. Although I couldn't find this backed up in any other sources, it's just kind of like a passing statement in one newspaper article. But it does suggest that if the dogs survived, they would have eventually made their way back home. So the likelihood is that the dogs went wherever Reed went. There's an interview with John, Reed's brother, posted on YouTube by John's own daughter. She has her own fairly successful YouTube channel called The Big Family Jewels. It kind of seems to be one of those Mormon family channels, but she has posted two very informative videos about Reed's case, obviously with Reed being her uncle. One being an interview with her dad John, in which he talks about his whole life but also talks about Reed, and another video from just 3 months ago in which he interviews the detective who reopened Reed's case back in 2010. But in the interview with John, he talks about his experience in the days after Reed went missing and how it seems the detective really focused in on him specifically as a suspect. He said that in those early days, a detective was in their home and asked him if he'd like to come with him to talk to a neighbourhood boy about Reed's disappearance. John happily agreed to do it and hopped in the patrol car and off they drove together. Only then the detective stopped the car, turned around and looked at him. The detective said, "Okay, John, where is he?" John said he didn't know. He didn't have anything to do with Reed's disappearance, but the detective didn't believe him. He reiterated that he knew that John knew where Reed was and he was causing immense heartache. He needed to stop playing games and tell everyone where Reed was. He threatened him with a polygraph test down at the station if he didn't tell the truth, and John said he was furious at being accused, and terrified as well, I'm sure. He was only slightly older than Reed, like barely older than him, like he was still a child, a teenager himself, being accused of knowing what was going on with his brother. John was incredibly upset that Reed, his brother and best friend, was missing. He was just as devastated as everyone else, and now he's being accused of being involved for basically no reason whatsoever. But John wasn't stupid. He said that he knew that if the detective confronted him, he knew his parents had given permission for the detective to do so. So John, who apparently had never really argued with his parents in his life, went home and confronted them. He was confused and upset that anyone would think he'd have anything to do with this, especially his parents. But his parents said their hands were tied. The detective had come to them saying that they thought that John might know something, and so they wanted Reed back. They were willing to do anything to do it, include confront their son. Everyone was hurt by this scenario, but nobody knew what to do to try and find Reed, because there was no evidence, there were no leads to follow. Besides the foothills, no one knew where to look. He'd just gone out to feed his dogs, and he'd vanished from their garden. The days passed and there continued to be no sign of Reed. Investigators looked into every possibility they could think of at the time, from foul play to accident, and by the end of November they were forced to admit that there was no indication of foul play. The family was insistent that it just wasn't in Reed's nature to just choose to run away, and besides, he left everything behind. He had a load of cash in his bedroom and he hadn't taken a single piece of clothing. It just wasn't a possibility to them that he chose to leave, and again, there was no evidence suggesting that that was the case, despite local gossip insisting that he must have run away. But time went on, Reed didn't come home, and this eventually just turned into a cold case. Suzanne, Reed's older sister, said to ABC4 in December 2021, "You're suspended in the unknown. There's no resolution. Year after year, there's no closure." Reed's remaining family, and it seems a lot of his siblings are still alive today, are still desperate for some sort of answer. And this is the pain of a missing persons case rather than a murder. At least with a known death, you can lay them to rest. You might have some answers. You don't have to live your life in a limbo thinking there's maybe a possibility that they might just walk through the door at any moment. With death, you can move on as best you can. When someone is just missing, you don't ever get that peace. And the Jeppson family really struggled with this, particularly their father, Edward Jeppson. He desperately missed Reed, and he also felt like with all the rumours flying around that he was losing his good name, and he convinced himself that this was all on him. Edward thought if he wasn't around, the family would be better off. And it's really hard to see the logic behind such thoughts, but mental health crises just aren't logical. Just over a year after Reed went missing, in December 1965, just 1 week before Christmas, Edward Jeppson ended his own life, which is just another victim of Reed's disappearance. If his disappearance was indeed foul play, this is another victim of the perpetrator. In terms of information from the 1960s, from the original investigation, that's about all I have for you. The case went cold and that was that. The community moved on, the Jeppsons tried to move on, and time passed. Lots of time passed actually, until 2010, when Reed's name came back to the attention of investigators. In 2010, around April, human remains were located at Mill Creek Canyon on Mount Olympus, which would have been just under 6 miles from the Jeppson home. These remains were completely decomposed, it was just bones, and it was clear that they'd been in this location for quite a long time. And when the news of these remains broke, one of Reed's sisters, clearly still on the search for her brother all those years later, called the Salt Lake City police to ask if they could possibly be the remains of her younger brother. She spoke to a detective, Cody Loki, who had never heard of Reed's case before, and he couldn't find any details about it in their modern day system. He actually had to go into the physical archives, where he did eventually find Reed's details on microfilm. And at this point in time, this case was so old that literally nobody was looking into it anymore. It just wasn't in the police consciousness. On the back of this, Detective Loki has said they did look briefly into the possibility of these remains belonging to Reed, but it quickly became apparent that whilst these remains had been here for a while, they hadn't been there over 40 years. The remains were eventually found in 2012 to belong to a man called Daniel No, who went missing around September 1978 whilst hitchhiking from Washington to Illinois. It was actually thought when Daniel went missing that he could have been a victim of John Wayne Gacy due to the timing and his end destination being Illinois, but when his brother contacted investigators about the possibility around 2012, the brother's DNA was taken and was matched to the Utah remains that were found 2 years earlier. It's not thought that anything nefarious happened to Daniel. He was an avid hiker, and something must have happened in the mountain that caused him to die. But this does go to show that even decades later, remains can be found and they can be identified. There's always hope. But for the first time now in 2010, Detective Loki had heard of Reed's case, and this just so happened to be National Missing Persons Week. The department at the time were looking for a missing persons case to highlight, and so Loki pushed Reed's name, finally after 46 years, bringing Reed's name back to the public's attention in Utah. He also managed to get Reed's case digitised, and he collected DNA from everyone in the Jeppson family to enter into CODIS. That's the USA's combined DNA index system that allows authorities to compare DNA profiles. The hope was that maybe Reed's remains had already been found and his DNA had been entered into the system and was just awaiting a match, awaiting ID. And obviously that didn't happen, but that was the hope. But this was a huge step forward for the family, even though there wasn't a match, because finally something was being done. Reed's case was being reopened. All the local media started talking about Reed's case, his face was out there again, and with this renewed interest, the police department received a very interesting call from a woman called Mary Jane, who lived in the house next door to the Jeppsons' old family home. It was actually in the process of being built when Reed went missing. Mary Jane said that she always knew about Reed Jeppson's case, she always knew about his disappearance, but one thing she hadn't known was that he'd disappeared with 2 dogs. And now with Reed's case making a reappearance in local media, she'd heard about the dogs, and when she heard this, her ears perked up. Because just a couple of years beforehand, her and her husband had been doing some renovations in the garden, and in digging the garden up, they had found 2 garbage bags that absolutely stunk. When they opened the bags, they found a number of bones. Apparently Mary Jane and the family just assumed off the bat that these were animal bones, that this was maybe somebody who had perhaps buried their dead dog in the garden, but they did call a local doctor they knew to come over and confirm this just in case, and they did confirm this was definitely dog bones. And I'm realising as I'm saying this, there are a lot of doctors in this story. There was Edward Jeppson, who was a doctor, there was the neighbour who was a doctor/surgeon, and this local doctor that Mary Jane called, all different people. With some foresight perhaps, Mary Jane actually did take some photos of the contents of these bags, but she didn't really worry about contacting the police with what she'd found because it was just animal bones after all, like it wasn't really going to be of interest to the authorities. So she did end up just throwing these bones out with the rest of their rubbish and it was all taken away and that was that. But now she saw the news about Reed and his 2 dogs. She knew that Reed lived next door, and she knew that perhaps this discovery might be of interest, and she contacted the police straight away. And luckily the police did take this seriously. The photos of the bones were sent to a forensic anthropologist who analysed it, and they came to the conclusion that they were looking at the remains of 2 separate dogs, one large dog and one small dog. Reed's dogs were an adult and a puppy. Obviously, with just photos, there was no way to confirm that these were indeed the remains of the German Shorthair pointers, but this was huge for Reed's case. Investigators contacted the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, who had already sort of helped them a bit in this case. They'd helped them create an age-progressed photo of Reed that they'd released to the public. But now NCMEC were able to help the police out by providing a ground-penetrating radar for a search of this garden. And very luckily for the police, Mary Jane actually already had an excavator at the house for some renovations that were ongoing, so they just used that. Police departments, especially like smaller time police departments, are always quite strapped for funds, and I can imagine that it was going to be pretty hard to try and get funding for a case that was over 50 or nearly 50 years old. Like, that wasn't going to be high on a priority list, so being able to get help with this radar and already having the excavator there, like, that was going to be quite helpful. The homicide team spent a full day at this house with the radar and cadaver dogs. Like, as soon as the dogs alerted to something, they would just dig, they would get the radars out. But they didn't find a single trace of anything. And at the same time as the physical search, investigators are also taking a good look at the man who lived in the house at the time of Reed's disappearance. Only, as I said, he wasn't living there at the time. The whole place was undergoing construction, it was being built, but this man owned it. He would have still been around, checking in from time to time on the progress, I'm sure. And what did they find out about this guy? Well, they found out that he had been accused of sexual assaults on multiple children, most of whom were teenage boys around Reed's age. Yeah, you can't make it up. It seems like this neighbour was spoken to at the time in the 60s, but he was never really flagged up as a person of interest. And you've got to bear in mind the context of this time as well. This was the 1960s. This neighbour was a doctor, a surgeon, who was held in very high regard in the community. So any accusations made against him would likely have been covered up pretty quickly, or just not brought to the attention of the police, or if it was, they wouldn't really take it seriously because you're always going to believe the word of a doctor over a child. His alleged assaults were also always kind of a grooming situation or an outright attack on the kids. He wasn't threatening people, he wasn't holding a gun to their heads. He was slowly, over time, building up these teenagers' trust and then violating it in the most horrific way imaginable. And things like this wouldn't have been seen the same in the 60s as they would be nowadays. If the teenagers, the children came forward, they would have been held responsible, like they would have been blamed for their part in this. And that's if they were even believed. I mean, who would believe a teenager over a doctor, a family man who was beloved by his children? So at the time, it was just never raised. But if it was never brought up in the original investigation, how did police find out about it all in 2010, decades later? It's not like when they went to question the neighbour, he would have admitted to anything. Well, it was actually Mary Jane who told the police the rumours that she'd heard. When they moved into this house, her son met a new friend at church who he invited over for a sleepover. And when the dad came to pick up the son the next morning, him and Mary Jane got to talking, and the dad said that he knew the previous owner and this home very, very well. And this was not a good review. The dad shared how he'd been violated, assaulted by the old owner as a young teenager. Now, of course, the investigators couldn't really just take Mary Jane at her word for this though, so they did some digging, and in doing so, they found multiple other victims as well. I think it was 6 victims in the end, but there could very well be more out there. They found that at least one of these victims had been paid off by the doctor at the time, and more recent suspected victims weren't willing to come forward and talk about their trauma. I mean, this dad had 40 plus years to process what had gone on. More recent victims didn't really have that. You would think that with so many alleged victims, the neighbour should have been arrested then and there. He was a paedophile, but the statute of limitations had long since passed. For these kinds of crimes in the 1960s, you're looking at just a 4-year statute. And that has since changed, thank God, but not retrospectively. So instead, investigators set up an interview with this neighbour who was now officially a person of interest. And of course, he denied any involvement in Reed's case. He also denied any involvement in any of the allegations against him. He did agree to take a voice stress test, which is a bit pseudoscience-y, kind of similar to a polygraph, and he failed it the first time, so asked to do it again, and then he passed. All in all, despite the allegations against him and his proximity to Reed's disappearance, there's never been any actual evidence against him in Reed's case. The neighbour has since died. He would have been very old, and investigators have spent a lot of time interviewing his friends and family, kind of building up a rapport with them. I think they were kind of hoping for some sort of deathbed confession, but such a thing never came, at least as far as the family have shared, and Detective Loki does think that if there was a deathbed confession, the family would have told him. It does seem like whilst the family doesn't know for sure about any of the accusations made against him, they don't seem to be that surprised by them, although they did always say that he was a very good father. None of his own children ever made any accusations against him. Loki has said that the neighbour's daughter at least seemed to maybe suspect that something had been going on, but she never really had any confirmation, and the neighbour's wife actually ended up taking her own life many, many years ago, and the reasons why are unknown. There's a lot of speculation, but I don't really need to get into it. From 2010, investigators threw all of the resources they had at this neighbour angle. I mean, you've got a teenage boy who goes missing who just so happens to be the preferred age of the molester who lived next door. You kind of have to look into that properly. But in the end, they had no more evidence than what they began with. They literally had nothing against him. And the only additional thing I want to add here on this neighbour angle is that Mary Jane said that when she moved into the house, being the second ever owner, like she bought it off this original neighbour, there was a very strange room in the downstairs of the house which locked from the outside with these big intense locks. At first they didn't really think anything of it, but knowing the extra context of knowing about the first owner's alleged history, it's definitely something questionable that police looked into, but again, nothing was found. At the same time as looking into the neighbour, there were also these big renewed searches going on in the surrounding area. They did a second dig around the gully that backed onto the Jeppsons' land. They dug around the St Mary's School, or what used to be the St Mary's School. It closed down a long time ago. They brought in the cadaver dogs again, but the searches yielded nothing. There is every chance, of course, that the neighbour had nothing to do with Reed's disappearance, but as investigators have said, it was very clear that he had a history of abuse, so he warranted a good look into anyway. Like, if they didn't get him on Reed, maybe they could get him on something else, but annoyingly, statute of limitations, they couldn't in the end. But all in all, there are three possibilities in this case, or at least three biggest possibilities. That Reed ran away, which is how it was kind of treated at the time. That maybe he was in some sort of accident or he was abducted by the neighbour or by somebody else. And many people do believe that this abduction theory just isn't that likely. Like, a lot of people, despite the neighbour, don't think that he could have been abducted. It seems he went to feed his dogs, and then, if the sighting is to be believed, he went to walk them quickly. So what if he got abducted on this route? Reed was a tough and strong kid. He was a wrestler, he was a footballer. Like, he would have put up one hell of a fight against an attacker. All of his siblings say that. And that's not forgetting the fact that he had 2 dogs with him, like a very protective breed. You're going to have to be really wanting to abduct Reed to be willing to put up with that kind of fight. And it's not like the abductor would have just taken Reed and let the dogs loose, because the dogs never came home. They were never seen again. So whoever took Reed took the dogs and killed them all. And that's one question I do have about the neighbour theory, because it would have been very easy for him to take Reed and not the dogs, so why would he do all 3? But then again, what about the dogs found buried in the garden? They were in bin bags. The person of interest neighbour was the only person to live there before Mary Jane and her family, so he must have been the one to bury these dogs on this land, whatever dogs they were. I wonder if the police were ever able to ask him the question and see if he did have dogs in his life that he buried on the land. I don't have an answer to that. I assume they would have asked that question. I do believe, though, that if this was an abduction, it was somebody known not only to Reed, but to the dogs as well. So maybe somebody stopped and offered to give Reed a lift home, give the dogs a lift home, and he agreed to take it. He got in a car, and that was that. It just had to be somebody known to the Jeppson family. It had to be somebody that Reed and the dogs went with willingly, because surely if there was a fight in the street, people would have seen that. There would have been signs of a struggle. In terms of the runaway theory, the Jeppsons have never really held much strength to it. Like, Reed did leave a decent amount of money, cash in his room, his clothes were untouched. He was possibly the happiest he'd ever been. He was thriving in life, he had no issues as far as anyone was aware. So why would he want to run away? There are some vague theories about how maybe there was a girl in Montana who he'd met at his family's ranch that summer, and that maybe Reed wanted to go and join her, but there's no evidence of that, and if that is what he did, he never made it that far. He never made it to Montana. Which brings us to the final potential theory here, that there was just some kind of accident. The area of Salt Lake City that he lived in, all of Salt Lake City really, is surrounded by mountains, gullies, crevices that he could very easily fall into. It's well within possibility that Reed took his dogs out for a walk and found himself in trouble. German pointers are hunting dogs after all, like that is what Reed trained them to do, so could it be that one of the dogs maybe took off, the other followed, and then Reed ran after them? Maybe one of the dogs fell down a crack, went into a cave, disappeared off into nature, and Reed, not thinking properly as he was only 15 years old, just decided to follow and try and help. If one dog fell into a crevasse, Reed may have tried to climb in after them and save them. These dogs were Reed's entire world. Like, he loved these dogs so deeply. And it could be that he was just trying to save them and got himself in trouble. Most of the searches in the immediate weeks after Reed's disappearance focused on the areas around the east side of the city. Hikers were told to keep an eye out for any sign of him. And a lot of people do go missing in these mountains. Reed's remains very well could still be out there somewhere. Or it could be possible that maybe one of his dogs got attacked by another animal. Black bears are native to Utah. And if the trio got attacked by a black bear, well, there wouldn't really be much left to find. Growing up in this area, I'm sure Reed would have known how to keep himself safe from bears and other native wildlife, but if a bear maybe went after his dog, well, maybe all sense would have escaped him. I do think there's a pretty big possibility that Reed's remains could just be somewhere in the foothills near his old house. Searches have continued over the last decade. In September 2012, a gully on the east side, which is about a half block away from where Reed disappeared, was searched and nothing was found. All of his family members were there waiting for just something. There was nothing. And that's where we're at. The case remains open to this day and the team continue investigating any new leads that come in. The Jeppsons are still waiting for an answer amidst all the rumour and speculation about this case. And although this case seems to be about as cold as they come, despite intensive reinvestigation bringing forward no new leads, all it does take is one person with one bit of information to open up a whole new avenue to look into. Honestly, the complete lack of evidence here does make me lean into some sort of nature accident, because how can there just be nothing? But who knows? I know this case is so old now. Reed would be in his 70s if he was still alive, but I will still leave contact details for the local authorities down below just in case. If you live in or around Salt Lake City, please share this video with people who are around in this time, because you never know who might hold the missing piece of the puzzle. Older relatives, older friends, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, just share this story. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really hope my very purry cat on my lap hasn't been too much of a distraction. Do you want to say hi to everyone, Rhubarb? Look at the camera. Say hi. Oh, that's a grumpy face. That's a very grumpy face. A lot of you say you quite like the purring in the back of the videos. Apparently it's very relaxing. I do agree, but sorry if it has been annoying, but she just wants cuddles. She just wants all the cuddles. With Reed being such an animal lover himself, I'm sure he wouldn't be that annoyed about an animal being present whilst his story is being told. Again, thank you for tuning in today. If you like what I'm doing here in this channel, then please don't forget to subscribe, to leave a comment down below, to like this video, just to let YouTube know that people are enjoying it and maybe they should push it out to other people. And yeah, I suppose I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.